What is the biggest lie that you have ever been told? Lie no one. My roommate freshman year of college told me his mom died the summer before the fall semester, and his father, an out-of-work veteran, could barely scrounge up money to pay the bills. As a result, myself and nearly all my friends paid for everything my roommate needed, whether it be a slice of pizza or even getting him concert tickets and clothes. My roommate lived on the other side of the country, so I never met any of his family members. I just knew that he flew by himself to and from school for breaks, and that his dad, a distant relative, would pick him up from the airport. My roommate claimed that he couldn't work either because he had to study 24/7 in order to maintain his full academic scholarship. Things got pretty awkward when I came back to school a day early after winter break and saw a message on our answering machine. This was years ago. It was from his mom, and she was just checking in. It was a rocky remainder of the semester. Lie no 2. After I broke up with my girlfriend in 8th or ninth grade, she got her brother and cousin to text and Facebook message me that she tried to kill herself and that it was all my fault. They did this for about 3 weeks where she was in a coma and probably wasn't going to make it out alive, and again that it was all my fault. Found out 3 years later that she was lying about the whole thing. Didn't see it until 3 months later, but thanks to whoever gave me gold. By the way, the only reason I broke up with her was 'cause she cheated on me and wouldn't admit to it. Lie no 3. I had a boyfriend who, on his own initiative, raised the idea that we might get married someday. I'd never thought about marriage before. We were in our early 20s at the time, but the more I thought about it, the more appealing it sounded. Every once in a while he'd bring it up, and we'd discuss details of our life together, where we'd live, how we'd allocate household duties, what we'd do with our surnames. These topics were always brought up by him on his initiative. Then I finished university and got an awesome job that could support both of us while he finished school. So I suggested he should look into how his school would calculate his financial need for bursary/loan purposes if we were cohabiting or married, as compared with how they do it now, so we could see if it's preferable to get married right away or to wait until he finishes school. And he promptly dumped me, saying that he never wanted to get married at all, and in fact didn't even want to be monogamous, and was only telling me that so I'd have sex with him. Which is ridiculous, because I entered the relationship just wanting sex too, and marriage, and monogamy, even, wouldn't have occurred to me if he hadn't brought it up in the first place. Lie no 4. Let me tell you something about Janice Ian. We were best friends in middle school. I know, right? It's so embarrassing. I don't even, whatever. So then in 8th grade, I started going out with my first boyfriend Kyle, who was totally gorgeous, but then he moved to Indiana. And Janice was like, weirdly jealous of him. Like, if I would blow her off to hang out with Kyle, she'd be like, why didn't you call me back? And I'd be like, why are you so obsessed with me? So then, for my birthday party, which was an all-girls pool party, I was like, Janice, I can't invite you because I think you're a lesbian. I mean, I couldn't have a lesbian at my party. There were gonna be girls there in their bathing suits. I mean, right? She was a lesbian. So then her mom called my mom and started yelling at her. It was so retarded. And then she dropped out of school because no one would talk to her. And she came back in the fall for high school. All of her hair was cut off, and she was totally weird. And now I guess she's on crack. Lie no 5. I love you. 7 wasted years, a divorce, and a daughter split between 2 parents later. It's easy to look back and see she stopped loving me after a few months. She even admitted at the end that she hadn't loved me for a while. She only stayed with me because she was too afraid to find somebody else after she figured out my best friend was only using her for easy sex. All the while we were engaged. I only found all of this out about a month after our daughter was born. Lie no 6. That my mom had newsletters which gave her a specific and absolutely verified secret document that said China was going to start a nuclear war with America in exactly 2008. I believed her for years and saw that date closely approaching, until I realized that she more or less believes random conspiracy gibberish. You know what's worse? I got old enough to realize it was all gibberish around 2004, maybe, but I forgot about it later until 2008. When I confronted her about it, she didn't even remember saying it. She had told someone under 10 years old that a nuclear holocaust was already set in stone for a certain date, so they better live life well now, causing them fear for years, but totally forgot about it since it was a casual offhand comment to her. Lie no 7. When I was a kid, my family went to America, and we visited Disneyland and SeaWorld, etc. But we had to leave my youngest sister at home, because she was an infant. Later on, she asked why we had all these photos of a random guy riding a killer whale. She didn't understand that he was a performer. So began the great conspiracy. I told her that it was our brother Ivan that she was too young to remember, and right after those photos were taken the orca had eaten him. It was a terrible tragedy, and I cautioned her never to mention it to our parents. My other brothers and sister, being awful people, helped keep this story going for years by occasionally whispering things about Ivan to her. We even had this plastic skull from the Indiana Jones ride that we claimed was the only part of his remains the U.S. would release to us. Lie no 8. No, I didn't cheat. You're CRA Zooey. You need help. Listen to yourself. 5 years later, I move past it and break up with him because I'm simply done, and after everything, I don't love him anymore. After weeks of crying and refusing to accept that we're completely over this time, even after I'd moved out, he asks me to meet him for one last dinner to discuss the division of property, etc. There at Chipotle, he admits to sleeping with those I suspected, including a mutual friend of ours. He said he'd never admit it because he knew I'd leave. He didn't need to admit it, and at that point I didn't care. To make it funnier, he asked if it changed my mind / anything now that he'd finally decided to be honest. No pay. Lie note 9. When I was a kid, my parents had me convinced that my betta fish was the 8th wonder of the world because it lived for 4.5 years. Turns out, they were just buying a new one every time the current one died. I was convinced that I was the most amazing fish caretaker in the world, that at that young age, I decided I was going to be a marine biologist. The idea continued until I got to college and realized biology really wasn't my thing at all, and changed my major. It's funny though, because since they're paying for college, their lie all those years ago eventually cost them an extra few years in college for me. Lie note 10. I had a boyfriend who, on his own initiative, raised the idea that we might get married someday. I'd never thought about marriage before. We were in our early 20s at the time, but the more I thought about it, the more appealing it sounded. Every once in a while he'd bring it up, and we'd discuss details of our life together, where we'd live, how we'd allocate household duties, what we'd do with our surnames. These topics were always brought up by him, on his initiative. Then I finished university and got an awesome job that could support both of us while he finished school. So I suggested he should look into how his school would calculate his financial need for bursary/loan purposes if we were cohabiting or married, as compared with how they do it now, so we could see if it's preferable to get married right away or to wait until he finishes school. And he promptly dumped me, saying that he never wanted to get married at all, and in fact, didn't even want to be monogamous, and was only telling me that so I'd have sex with him, which is ridiculous, because I entered the relationship just wanting sex too, and marriage, and monogamy, even, wouldn't have occurred to me if he hadn't brought it up in the first place. Lie no 11. One night I went downstairs to ask my mother something. My dad was a light sleeper, and would get really pissed if anyone woke him up, so I whispered, "Mom, Mom." All of a sudden my dad sat up and yelled at me to get lost. They told me I should never sneak up on them because they had a gun, and my dad thought I was an intruder and almost shot me. They scared the bejesus out of me. Sometimes, when I tried to get to sleep, I'd remember how my dad almost shot me. For years, even after I moved out. Decades later, I mentioned it to my mom. She started laughing and told me they were having sex. There was no gun. Lie no 12. That my parents split up when they were young. At 13, I found out that my dad had cheated on my mom, and she couldn't forgive him. I then found out that this cheating had resulted in a 12-year-old boy. Yes, they split when I was 5 weeks old, who both my parents knew about, but I didn't. At 21, I found out my father was raped. Men being raped by women, especially in the military, didn't really happen 30 years ago. No one thought anything of the barmaid serving my dad free drinks all night and insisting on taking him to his room. My dad woke up the next morning to 4 things. A note from the woman telling him she had a good time. My mom's engagement ring from when she caught him. A hell of a custody battle on his hands which he lost. A lifelong alcohol addiction. Just a side note, when my dad eventually told my mom as adults that he didn't consent to the cheating and he sought help, she was really understanding, and they are now good friends and co-parents. Lie no 13. This lie was told by all parents in this town. Mainly they told their children that if you got a venereal disease, then your life is ruined. The goal was to scare the kids into not having sex, but it had tragic consequences. In my hometown, a 17-year-old kid put a shotgun under his chin. It blew off his jaw and everything below his eyes. He survived, and about 10 years ago, I was in town and saw a very thin guy with no jaw and a cloth covering his face. I think it was him at about 45 years old. The reason he did it was not reported at the time, but many years later my mom told me that he tried to kill himself because he had a wet dream and thought the emission was a sign of venereal disease. His parents, like all parents around here, had always told him that if he got VD, then his life was ruined. There was no internet to answer our questions back then, so without being able to get any other information about what happened, he decided to kill himself. The parents of that town knew what happened, but they decided not to tell any of their kids the truth because it was better to risk more suicides than to provide any sex education.